My name is Przegalińska. I'm one of the co-founders of Opero, and basically my main task here was to calm you down and to start the event. But otherwise, I really appreciate you coming here. I very much appreciate the distinguished guests which took our invitation for today's event. And I'm very glad that we managed to pull together as Aspen another event together. I think what we share a little bit with Aspen is sort of shared passion or curiosity in things or topics which, in our opinion, are the sort of current phenomenon which really will make an impact on the society for the future. I think today's event or today's topic is a good example of that. So I'm glad we are here, and I hope you enjoy. But because I'm very much looking forward to the actual content, that will be everything for myself, and I will hand over the floor to Mr. Schneider, the director of Aspen Institute, who will introduce the guests and the event. Thank you very much and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you for this wonderful venue and wonderful cooperation. I see a lot of friends, but also a lot of faces we haven't seen before. So this is Aspen. We are a platform opening for other people to join and to discuss, and I'm glad it works. It works because we are lucky that we have people around Aspen who are dealing with interesting topics which are driving a debate today. And one of the goals of our operation here in Central Europe, this is a task of Aspen Central Europe, but the whole Aspen family, Aspen network around the globe, is to deal with the values, ideas. It's not just any idea, but the good ideas, and the positive impact of innovation and technology. Not just any impact, but the positive side of that impact on humanity. And so that's the purpose where we join the forces. And before I give floor to Daria Hvížďalová, who will be moderating this, and I'm glad we've got a moderator which could be a speaker. So thank you that you will be moderating it. Daria was speaking at TEDx, and she's a consultant, and she's associated with JHV-Engineering, and also with Neuron, which is visibly behind these activities, and thank you for this. We're happy, Monica, that we can cooperate very loosely and in a good mood on these events. It's my pleasure and honor, and it wasn't planned originally, that I can introduce to you the Vice President of Aspen, United States, Mr. Elliot Gerson. And he will share with you a few words. The reason, I think one connection why he's here is that we cooperate with companies, and this time we cooperate with Microsoft, and we cooperate globally. This is not just our branch of Aspen which cooperates with Microsoft on the issue of the impact of artificial intelligence. So since we do this globally with Microsoft and Seattle, I think it's only natural that we have here Elliot, our friend. The floor is yours, Elliot, and then we pass the floor to Daria and the other speakers.
Thank you very much. Very conscious of being the third speaker. You're here actually to hear everyone else, so I will try to be very brief. But it's always a pleasure for me to be in Prague. I'm in Europe this week. I have just been in Davos. I much prefer being in Prague any day than being there, and particularly with my friends in the Aspen Institute family. Let me just say a little bit, because I'm sure many of you aren't familiar with Aspen. Aspen. And I'll tell you why I think Aspen is so wonderfully connected with the kind of topic that you're going to be talking about that's disappeared here. So I hope you remember why you're here. But issues relating to things like artificial intelligence, what it means, fundamental questions about the intersection of technology and society, questions about, will this be creating things that will enhance human life and opportunity in myriad ways, or on the other side, is it more possibly some kind of a Frankenstein? How are we going to be able to embed human values in this? What is it going to mean for all of us? These are the kinds of questions that have animated Aspen Institute discussions since we were founded in the United States now about 70 years ago. We were founded in Aspen, Colorado, which is now our summer headquarters. Our base is in Washington, D.C. We're a very large NGO institution in the United States, more than 500 employees, one of the largest places, one of the largest institutes like what we are. And we really look at fundamental questions. We're nonpartisan, we're an educational institution, but we're also a policy institution. But what makes us different from many others is that, first of all, we're scrupulously nonpartisan, and we always look at the underlying values in the issues that we're looking at. We're not strictly a technical analysis kind of a think tank. And that goes back to the founding principles. A German-American named Walter Paepke founded the Institute because he was very concerned at that critical time, after the horrors of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War. He was very concerned as he perceived there would be a great battle between capitalism and communism, that people were overlooking the fundamental questions about what humans are like, what our common values are. And he actually brought people, he was a CEO of a major company, he brought fellow CEOs, heads of state, heads of universities, representatives of civil society and media. He brought them to Aspen, a beautiful place like Prague, but a rural, beautiful place, to get away from their businesses and their communities and to ask fundamental questions. As a matter of fact, the Aspen Institute was originally called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. So these kinds of questions, these deep, profound philosophical questions that animate how we run our businesses, how we operate our communities, how we think things should work, what we think we all have in common when there are various kinds of conflict, are what we are all about. I'm also delighted to say that idea that he had in 1949 has caught on in many other countries as well. So we're very proud to have a full partner institute here in Prague, Aspen Central Europe. There are now 10 Aspen Institutes around the world, 7 of them here in Europe, 2 in Asia, 1 in Latin America. And finally, I want to express my particular thanks to Microsoft for creating what they call this next generation network, bringing together leaders from technology and business and media and government and civil society to grapple with these fundamental questions. This is the third in the series of them. The first was at the Aspen Institute in Mexico. The next one was at the Aspen Institute, our oldest overseas institute in Berlin. We're here today, and I think the next one will be in New Delhi. So all of you are part of what is going to be a global conversation that I hope will inform everyone's thinking and not just lead to people in audiences going home and thinking more deeply and more critically about these issues, but bringing people, especially young people, who are going to be really implementing the future here to new ideas to assure that as technology develops, it develops truly with the best interests of everyone. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to be in such a wonderful space. This is absolutely perfect for a conversation like that. And finally, you're going to get to hear our wonderful moderator and our superb guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daria, and it's my pleasure to be here with you tonight in this wonderful venue venue, which Elliot has just mentioned, which, as I recently found out, served as a center for all the inspiration for a lot of artists in the beginning of the 20th century, for the first movements which were promoting the intercultural discourse, the curiosity, the learning from abroad. It was all happening right here, and I think it's wonderful that a century later we're still upholding this tradition together here with Opero, the networking space, and opening up this civil discourse and the informed discussion, which I think is very important in the current age, in the current day, where we are overflowing with information, and especially on the multi-layer and complex topics such as AI and its impact on the society. Because the informed discussion is the key of what is going to happen here tonight, we are proud to have three wonderful experts who are going to share their expertise with us, and also to tackle the topic of artificial intelligence from three different perspectives. From the technological perspective, from the policy perspective, and from more of a societal and philosophical perspective. Now, what is going to happen is that three of them are going to introduce themselves to you, tell you a little bit about their work and their opinions on the topic, which will then be followed by a panel discussion, which we hope you will also be a part of, and then we will follow up to a small networking drink up until the venue is going to be closed. So that's our plan for tonight, and now I'm happy to introduce the first speaker up here on stage, who is a proud Czech, an alumnus of the Technical University in Brno. His name is Tomáš Mikolov, and he's a research scientist at Facebook. He was continuing his research on recurrent neural networks, which he started in Brno in America, in Google Brain. After that, Tomáš has been working on a vector representation of the words, the model words to vec, which he's created together with his team, has recently received a prominent award by Neuron, which is a fund, a benevolent fund for the support of science in the Czech Republic. And on top of all of that, Tomáš's long-term research goal is to create intelligent machines which would be capable to learn and communicate with humans using the natural language. Let's welcome Tomáš Mikolov.
Thanks for the introduction. So we'll be today talking about like the technological part of the discussion. I hope I can switch the slides. Can you open it? Oh, yeah, okay. I tried it. Sure. No. Okay, I know. Great. You're supposed to address these questions today, and I think that all of them are actually like very, very difficult ones and open-ended. But I must say that I don't even think that we can actually answer them with like some 100% certainty, because they are like very difficult and philosophical. Like, how do we ensure, for example, that AI will be a good technology, not bad technology in the long term? I think that we can't actually say this about any sort of technology, because it's very difficult to predict the outcomes of pretty much anything. You can ask the same questions about whether electricity is a good technology for humanity. I believe that it is, but you know, like you can have even different opinions. So it's very difficult to answer these questions right away. So I think that we can start a little bit like the other way around. Like I will say first what usually we mean by AI research these days, because it's like a very popular term, but it's not very well explained in the media, and it's used a lot these days. Where, for example, some people try to convince you that some autonomous robots are very, very near, and in 5 or 10 years we will like full AI, like from the science fiction movies. Well, it's not really the case. If you're an AI researcher, usually by AI we actually mean machine learning, which is just a subset of AI research, but it's that subset that actually did make the most progress in the last decade, and that's what usually actually works in practice. Many of the machine learning models can be described by something like this. So basically, the point of machine learning is to find a model that can transform the input features into some outputs that are going to be useful for us. And many problems can be defined this way. I hope that they can still turn it down. It's just which button to do? Okay, thanks. So I will just continue talking about this. So the model itself, we try to basically find some parameters that will be transforming the input features into the outputs. where the outputs can be pretty much anything. On the next slide that I will be able to show in a short time, I have an example where you can imagine that as the input you have some picture, and as the output you have some classifier objects that are possibly in the picture. So you can, for example, have a picture of a cat, and at the output you have some probability distribution over what animals are present in the picture, and that's going to be okay. I think it's turning on again. No, not yet. Okay, so I'll continue with other slides. And you can have, of course, many other examples. You can have, for example, a sentence at the input, and the output can be, for example, a decision whether the sentence has a positive or negative sentiment. You can have a sentence at the input that is set in, say, English, and at the output you can have the same sentence translated, for example, to Czech. So there are like many problems that can be seen as some transformation of some input vector into some output vector. And the machine learning is really about finding a model that does this transformation with the highest possible accuracy, where we define some objective function that tells us how close we are to the perfect functionality. So that's actually, it's not very magical. Once you see this, then you can quickly realize that the point of machine learning is really like to do something that is very well mathematically modeled. Like there are like some very clear equations that actually we use that tell us how to change the parameters, or how to choose the parameters of the model so that we would be doing this functionality with the highest accuracy possible. And that's the point of machine learning, to develop as good architectures of the models as possible and to reach the best possible accuracy. Now, when it comes to ethics, if you would actually go deep into these equations, it's actually not that difficult to see that it's all math. There's no ideology in these mathematical models, and no racism, no political opinions. So they are basically just transforming the input vectors into output vectors. And the point here is that you don't have to be worried about the state of the machine learning technology these days. It's not some autonomous technology that does something on its own. It just basically tries to produce outputs that are as close to the outputs that we would want to as possibly doable for a given problem. What you can be actually worried about more, and that's actually not very clear from some news that I sometimes see in the media, is how are actually these models trained? You actually need a training set. Okay, now is the picture with the cat. So that just goes back to basically how it looks like. The input image, and we have the output, and also the probability distribution. But what you should be actually worried about is the training set that is used for actually finding those models. So even if I said that the model itself doesn't have any ideology, if the training set actually has some biases, and it always does, more or less, then the classifier, basically the model that we find, will have these biases as well. For example, you can imagine that the human annotator will always annotate in this training set all the pictures of cats as being cute cats and all the dogs as ugly dogs. It's very much like a bias in the human annotator, but the machine that, again, doesn't have any opinions of its own, will be just copying these labels, will be saying about pretty much every cat that it sees that it's a cute cat, and for every dog it will just say, oh, it's ugly dog. So that's actually a bias that is present in the training set. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way. It's also like there's a choice of the training examples. You can actually have an annotator that is completely fair, but if the person who actually picks the training examples picks only the examples of pictures of cats that are cute and pictures of dogs that are ugly, then the annotator can be completely fair, but the classifier will be still saying that all the cats are cute and all the dogs are ugly. So that's quite a problem. So I would say that when it comes to the current state of the art of machine learning, and that's actually what AI is about, then if you want to see whether there is something unfair going on, then you should probably ask about what is in the training data. Is the distribution of the classes unbiased? Is it unfair? I think that's actually much more like obvious thing to look at than some others. Of course, then there could be also biases coming up in the deployment. If you, for example, use the model in practice and you allow it to adapt to the user behavior, then the model itself can be picking up the biases coming from the users. So it's not really the technology that is coming up with these biases, it's just copying the opinions of the people. Okay, and it's continue. No. It's really funny. Okay. No, that's too far. Okay. Maybe when I click this button, just minus the other one. Okay, I will be more careful. Okay. So for me, the conclusion is that the machine learning often amplifies these existing biases that are present in the humans, either the human annotators who are providing the labels for the training phase of these systems, or it can be even the people who basically create these data sets, who pick the training examples. So there is actually no racism or ideology in these models, but still the classifications coming from these models can actually show a lot of biases, but it's really like the biases in the humans. To give maybe more concrete example, if you think, for example, about the recent discussion about the fake news in America, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that both like Democratic Party and Republican Party are claiming that the other one is basically lying in the media and is claiming things that are not true. So it's quite a difficult problem, but then there's also a problem that many of the technological companies in the Silicon Valley are actually pro-democratic, so they only have some sort of bias that they are more likely to pick more negative examples from the party that they don't like, and so on. So actually, if you want to be sure that, for example, fake news is detected without these biases, then I think the best is to actually know at least the statistics of the training set, so that you know that both the positive and negative examples from both classes are represented with the same frequency, because otherwise the classifier will be unfair. And I would also say that with any sufficiently complex technology, it's pretty much impossible to basically answer the questions from the beginning, which was basically how do we ensure that the AI technology will in the future promote democracy and similar values. I don't think we can actually ensure any of these. It's basically the human users who will be using this technology, who will be basically promoting their views. So AI is really like a tool for humans, and we have to be asking these questions for the human users of AI. But of course, once we understand this technology better, which I hope that at least these few slides that help you with a bit, also the projector seems to be a little bit broken today, then I think if you understand what is actually going on, then you maybe can be a little bit less scared about like these killer world scenarios which you can see in the media quite often, which I would say is like a very, very distant future, and probably also not the future that we are interested in as researchers, but maybe what is more like important for us is to think about how these machine learning models are trained, what training data we use, and whether the decisions are done by automatic classifiers that actually did see some fair distribution of the training examples, that the classifiers are not biased either by mistake or maybe by intention. So that's all for me, and I will give the microphone to the second speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Tomáš. I'm afraid the microphone has to go through me first, so that I can introduce our wonderful second speaker. It's Ms. Cornelia Kutterer, who's the Senior Director of EU Government Affairs for Microsoft. In her role, she's responsible for AI and privacy policies, especially in regards to the new emerging technologies and how should the new laws and regulations evolve in regards to these new technologies. She mentions multiple times in her interviews and talks that multi-stakeholderism is something that she very strongly believes in, and seems to be very interested in finding a holy grail of the regulatory affairs. The policies that would not only reflect the current state of technology and the future of technology, but also to allow us to support all the fundamental human rights over picking up some specific one. I hope that was correct, and I will pass the microphone further to you to tell us more about what you do.
This is a little bit of a challenge with a mic, computer, and let's see. Okay, that works. Fantastic. So I was thinking about how I would start this discussion. First of all, as a lawyer, it's always more difficult to have such a conversation when you have two data scientists in the same panel. So I feel a little bit handicapped here tonight. When we think through this, or if I present myself with data points, the data points will give you a picture about me, so I could give you any data points and we are not entirely sure what the output would be. It's interesting to think through this. In early times of human history, our humanity was basically defined by myths, and that's how we believed we are. And after that, really through Renaissance, we go all about measurements, and I think it's really important to think through this in terms of what we're doing now. Today, we believe in data correlations. That's what AI really does. But we don't really know what we don't know, and I think it's really interesting just to keep that a little bit in mind. So why do we all talk about this? Because computers in the last couple of years have achieved human parity in object recognition, speech recognition, machine reading comprehension, and human parity in machine translation. These are big slides. It's a new format of Microsoft. You need to put them a little bit together. And so it's just with all of that, it's interesting to think through what's going to happen. What are the predictions? Now, I'm not a data scientist, as I already mentioned. So I spoke with our data scientist, and one of the key researchers, Eric Horvitz, a leading AI data scientist. His predictions, I give you a couple of them, is that by 2050, we're still not anywhere close to AI researchers understanding the mystery of intuition or common sense. But we will see by 2030 connected cars in streets, and we will see by 2025 numerous laws that will come into place. Some of them because in the meantime we will also have seen some events happening that might have some impacts that are seen as very costly for society. Think of what can be done with technology nowadays in disguising that you are someone else, or you speak about someone else. By 2025, and this is where I'm coming more to what I know about, we'll see some laws that, for example, we don't know exactly where first, but we will see some laws about the fact that we will have to disclose if you are interacting with bots. We will see liability rules, and we will see also some rules about facial recognition, and we will see further rules evolving around privacy. How do we get from here to 2025? It's not that long, but we're starting to see this ethical conversation happening, and it's really about ethics and empathy. It's really about what computers should be doing, not what they can do. And so we are in a times of geopolitical stress. Our debates currently is all about anxiety. We have been seeing first uses of AI that are fairly scary, like AI classes used by the police in China, or facial recognition for social ranking in China. we've seen first use of AI systems in autonomous weapons, and we see quite some negative impact around discriminations and biases. And Tomáš was already talking a little bit about biases. Those are examples that have been discussed quite a bit in the United States, such as the discrimination against women. When you search for CEOs on search engines, you might get mainly male CEOs. The other example is an example from a software called Compass in the United States, used to predict whether or not someone will recommit a crime released from jail. Compass, ProPublica NGO, has widely reported about those types of biases. Hence, there is a lot of work going on in major tech companies. Major tech companies have together created a partnership on AI to discuss these issues and involve a number of ethical guidance. In Microsoft, we've created Ether, the AI Ethics in Engineering and Research Committee, who in various subcommittees across the company think through important issues that require more policy guidance and eventually even law as we go. The first is sensitive uses of AI. There is the question for a company that delivers and produces AI, whether or not we're going to sell to every and anybody our products. So there is the question around, do we sell those in, for example, undemocratic states? What type of uses? What are the restrictions we should give in our contractual relations when we deliver those AI services? The question about AI reliability and safety goes back to the machine learning. If there is biases in the data and a doctor has different results, how can we ensure that AI that is trained in a closed environment and when it goes out in the open, how can we ensure that it remains reliable and safe also in unpredicted situations? Human AI and collaboration interactions, something I'm pretty sure Aleksandra will talk a little bit more about. Fairness and bias, we just have had some examples. And then the question about how do you actually make AI transparent. We talk a lot about the black box in the context of AI, but what if you need to understand the reasoning behind it? If decisions are made that impact human beings, those questions are very difficult for data scientists to answer, but we're trying to advance those conversations. Recently, beyond our AI principles that we have developed, we have seen that there are some uses in some technologies that are so impactful that we want to have a broader dialogue and actually call for regulation fairly in a matter of urgency as well, and that is facial recognition. Facial recognition technology is obviously tremendous opportunities that are possible. For example, in India, with facial recognition, children have been found and we found that were lost. Seeing AI is a technology that we use in Microsoft for enabling blind people to see and get explained the surroundings in which they walk and live. At the same time, we do see that through biases and the technology, and there are also a number of issues. Those are privacy, bias, and democratic freedoms. And on the privacy side, it's a little anecdote of my my winter vacation with my family. We went to Rome when I was a child. What we usually did, we counted cars. We looked at the cars. We walked through the streets of Rome, and my 10-year-old son, he was actually counting surveillance cameras, CCTV cameras. And there's an amazing amount of CCTV cameras in Rome, I can tell you. Then biases, we talked about it. If surveillance, if the data that is used for those surveillance operations, but the data has biases in there, that can obviously impact fundamental rights and freedoms. Last but not least, democratic freedoms. If there is no regulatory framework around the use of surveillance from the government itself or in undemocratic states, our democratic freedoms might be really endangered. So what do we need? We need, first of all, a well-informed market. We need to understand the technology. We also need to be able to test the technology. We need to be able to understand whether there are biases in there, and they need to be tested by third parties. We need to have privacy regulations around it, and in Europe, of course, we do have general data protection regulations since May last year that is enforced, that gives us a good foundation that helps. It's not only GDPR. In Europe, of course, we also have the Data Protection for Law Enforcement Directive, which was enforced at the same time, which restricts the usage of surveillance cameras without legal ground for law enforcement in Europe. However, when you think through how many laws have just in the last 5 years changed in different countries in Europe that provide the legal basis for using those cameras, we come to a very different look at this. And this has been going on really a little bit unseen by the public debate, also not in the context of the broader question around democratic freedoms in the context of AI, but most of these laws were really adopted in the context of an increased fear and loss of security given the heightened risks of terrorism. Now, what's happening next on the path to a regulatory framework that I hope we are going to discuss in a little bit more detail in Europe. The European Commission has established a high-level group on AI that has been starting last year in September its work to develop guidance on ethics for trustworthy AI in Europe. And there's currently a consultation going on but for the draft that this high-level group has pulled together. When you look through the 10 principles that they have developed, they were very similar to those that Microsoft had developed a year before, and we also have been engaging with the high-level group extensively in that discussion. So, in this path and for the discussion that we're going to have, the foundational rules that Europe has, and not each region in the world does have privacy rules as we have here. The foundational rules to have a good AI framework, I'd say, are to be seen in GDPR and the General Data Protection Regulation, as well as in the Law Enforcement Directive that restricts or that regulates the data processing for law enforcement authorities. We are approaching a state where we are starting to have a better conversation around how these laws should look like through the AI high-level group. But this is not the only group that is currently thinking about this. There's also the liability expert groups. It's actually two that are looking in how the evolvement or the liability discussions need to be further evolving. So I'm saying this is approaching because we're in an interesting state in the European Union. The period of this commission is ending. There will be elections this year, and we will have a new commission by autumn, I think, if everything goes right, in 2019. So this commission will not start to legislate now, and it's interesting because Commissioner Jourova actually was in Brussels just yesterday with our President Brad Smith on his way to Davos, and we were discussing precisely what are the next steps for Europe to take in that space. And while they all recognize that there is need to be done, now there is a bit of a caution here in terms of what they're going to do. There's a lot of prep work going on in Europe, which is really good, to basically develop the next aspiration of the European Commission, the next digital strategy that will most likely come to life by the end of 2019. Why I'm saying all of that is that by 2025, which is the end of the next Commission, we will very likely have an EU AI framework that will cover both competition, which I have not touched upon, but certainly in addition to privacy involvements, liability, and ethics. And so Europe is currently really seen as a leading region in ensuring a fundamental rights and human rights, human-centric AI. With that, I'll give back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Aleksandra Przegalińska, who is coming from MIT Center for Collective Intelligence. She is also an assistant professor at Kozminski University in Warsaw, where she is a part of a group very curiously called NERDS, which actually stands for the New Research on Digital Societies. Aleksandra is doing research on fascinating fields such as wearable technology and its impact on us as human beings, the interactions of us as human beings with the digital beings, and etc. So Aleksandra is about to tell us a bit more, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, as you might have seen already, AI is utterly philosophical. There are more questions than answers, and this is exactly how kind of philosophy functions. And apparently for AI, it's very similar, at least now. So I am now a data scientist. I used to be a philosopher, but I'm trying to ask some philosophical questions in the research that we are conducting. Oh, Mark Twain is here, and thank you. And now me. Possibly, hopefully. Okay, perfect. Let's wait. The system knows what's best. So,
Matrix will always.
Yeah, the matrix needs to reconfigure itself to adapt to our needs and become fully ambient intelligence. Hooray! Finally. There. All right. But it was, I saw it actually at some point. Should I click? Yes. Perfect. Okay, so we've been talking here obviously a lot about AI. It's a bit of a cryptic term, but I think in fact it's an umbrella term that covers many different subfields, right? And this is the easiest way to define it. And within that field there are obviously some different methodologies. There's this magical one called machine learning. Within that you have deep learning, which is even more magical. I guess to some extent. And AI itself is a discipline that embraces many different practices, let's say data scientific and computer scientific practices. Among them you have, let's say, also computer vision that was mentioned here. You also have natural language processing that I'm also partially dealing with. And you have this black circle called reasoning that we have not really reached yet, right? But we're, I guess, aspiring that somehow. So I wanted to really share our research with you, and I wanted to embed it in a very particular kind of AI, which is chatbots, natural language speaking entities that are able to, let's say, perform in processing natural language, the language that we all use, and talk to us, because that's the focal point of my work. So there's a lot going on in this field. Good stuff, let's say, and bad stuff too. Perhaps stuff that can make us feel a bit concerned. There are quite interesting attempts to put more, let's say, machine learning into chatbots to make them even more able to interact with you. And maybe some of you have seen Google Duplex that was released in March. Let's say at least partially, it's a system by Google, by DeepMind, that is able to interact with humans in such a way that is barely recognizable from humans. And as such, obviously, it is quite inspiring. On the other hand, it's also a point to think about, do we want to be informed whether we're talking to a machine, especially if a machine doesn't tell us that fact. It will probably in the future, because we can require some transparency, but nonetheless, I think on a more philosophical level, that gets even more interesting, because you can say that the Turing test as a paradigm is over. Essentially, with newest developments, not only by Google, but also Microsoft and several other companies, we have deep learning chatbots that are suspending the paradigm that used to be very important for this particular discipline. Turing test was all about recognizing whom you're dealing with. Today, it's no longer doable to recognize that, so, the only way to try and recognize is to flag such a system, right? So I think it completely redefines that, let's say, anthropological, philosophical concept of checking who is who. And that's, I think, a very important point. Now, chatbots are relevant also for other reasons, and that's because they are very often built for good purposes, but can be misused, right? And I wanted to bring the example of Typebot that is actually was designed by Microsoft to have very good interactions with Twitter users. And it turned out that it was misused by haters, and it started spreading hate speech on its own. And this kind of shows us how sometimes technologies can be very vulnerable if they're built in such a way that you want to make them open to others. And I think it was a very important lesson for everyone. I think, it could have happened to anyone, but it's a lesson that should be processed and digested by everybody. And that's kind of the context of our research work. And now, okay? Can we do okay? Yes. The system says yes. Another interesting event, also circling around AI, is an initiative by DeepMind that is just a promise. I'm sorry, the pictures are missing, but you can try and use your imagination. There was a picture of TomNet, a theory of mind network. Now, when I was studying philosophy, theory of other mind was just a philosophical concept, right? But you couldn't say that we can do it in practice. Now it turns out that DeepMind wants to build a system, a virtual assistant, that is going to be able to process the fact that you have different mental states and that you're going through different phases while you're mentalizing, and also that you have different intentions and emotions. It's not going to be conscious on its own, but it's going to have an idea that you have a consciousness and that you're changing. Now, I don't know whether this idea can be fully embedded. Not much has been shown yet, but the fact that somebody is trying to embed philosophical concepts from the philosophy of mind into practice on its own shows us how relevant chatbots are and how much of a philosophical project AI per se is. So now, I wanted to show you what we are doing, and for that I wanted to use quite a few examples, but as you can see, this is a cryptic picture without pictures. It's like a blank space. I wanted to show you here the first ever chatbot created. Probably some of you have heard about it. It's Eliza. Interestingly enough, in terms of natural language speaking, it was a very, very simple system. It was just inverting the phrases that you have used, changed them a bit, and so on. Oh, now it's gone. Anyways, Eliza is interesting on its own because Eliza was a kind of system that was super, let's say, dumb in some ways, just processing, language on a very syntactic level. It was also using a procedure called none. That meant that whenever your sentence was non-grammatical, it would reply with "oh really," just to tell you "oh really." right? That's what we do too, very often when we don't want to talk to someone. That's what I do, like, oh, really. Nonetheless, it was a system that was used in a very particular context. It was a system that was used as a psychotherapist, Rogerian psychotherapist that is supposed to echo what you think and guide you through the process of self-recognition, let's say. And it was very successful in doing that. Despite its scarcity and the fact that it was very, very simple as a system, it was able to perform as a psychotherapist, and people, even when they found out they were just interacting with the system, they would still, yes, say, I want that therapy, it was a great therapist, so I want to continue. And actually to Joseph Weizenbaum, who was the guy who invented that system, that was very bad, because he thought that he would prove otherwise. And he got depressed, and he became the first, I think, really, in a way, victim of artificial intelligence as a project, and he decided never to create bots again. So I think that's why the field of chatbots is so interesting and intriguing, because you can simulate many things, you can simulate human behaviors, and through that you can also inspire humans to behave in a certain way, right? But simulation is not all. So are we going to have the slides back at some point? I'm hopeful that that's going to be the case. So there are other chatbots, or there were other chatbots that were supposed to be created with a different idea in mind. So even though there were many, let's say, scientists who thought that the best idea they could have is to create chatbots that are going to be good at simulation, for instance, a paranoid chatbot. One that always tells you somebody's following me all the time. Yeah, that's a good simulation, let's say, of a paranoid person, and it also does not require any data scientific effort. But is that where we want to go? Other people have thought, no, we have to really explore natural language processing as a field, as an interesting field, as an inquiry to understand how people process language, also on the semantic level. And thus, for instance, chatbots like Alice were created. Alice was an interesting chatbot that was just not only focusing on, like, let's say, using syntax, but also would focus on only certain phrases in the language that you use mostly. That's called Zipf's law, and that allows you to really build certain trees of knowledge only around phrases that are most useful. And that was already in progress. Now today, we have even more interesting chatbots. We have chatbots like Cortana by Microsoft. We have chatbots like Siri. We have chatbots like Google Now, currently turning into Duplex. We have Alexa by Amazon. And I think it's a very open field of what's going to happen next. What we surely do know is that probably chatbots are the next relevant interface. After desktop, after mobile, we're currently switching, let's say, to chatbots that are probably going to be the interface for millennials, for younger generations. This brings many interesting questions on board. There was recently a study done by MIT Social Robotics Research Group, and they were looking at children interacting with chatbots like Alexa particularly. And it turned out that children change the tonality of their voice very often because they talk to Alexa. So they talk to Alexa in a certain way, and they then try to talk like that with other peers, right? So they use the same tonality because Alexa is so important for them. Like in a way, because of the fact that Alexa is at home, it changes the way their speaking patterns are being built. So that's quite a lot. And now the pictures are back, so you can see all those different interesting chatbots that are there. Now, what is interesting for our research group is why certain chatbots and also robots fail to perform well and why they make people feel eerie. That's called the uncanny valley. It's a hypothesis that has been well researched in the field of human-machine interaction, and it tells us that there are certain humanoid, human-like technologies that we accept, but there are certain others that we are afraid of and not too happy interacting with. And for us, it's quite relevant to find exactly those spots where this acceptance level kind of goes down, and then we start to feel that whenever we're interacting with this particular chatbot or robot, it feels like a zombie, like something that is neither alive or dead, that cannot be classified as a living being, and that makes us very confused. So what we're trying to do is we're also building, and for that we have an interesting experimental protocol. We're trying to build different chatbots with different interfaces, with different features and capacities, to see which ones cause certain, let's say, affective responses in humans. So we put many electrodes on people and then we see kind of what happens, essentially. That's not all, but like, on a certain level, that's what it is. So here you can see some results of one of our, let's say, research experiments that we did, where we were trying to compare two different chatbots. Let's go back. The one that had face, gaze, and voice, and another one that was just text-based. And people had the same task of talking about specific subjects to both of these, and then we wanted to compare using our, let's say, neuroscientific protocol and all the electrodes we have used, how affected were people by that chatbot. And it turned out that the simple text chatbot is not really very, let's say, engaging for the people who are investigated, whereas the one with avatar and sound was much more engaging, which turned for us, it meant that these people were really much more invested in the conversation with the one that had sound and voice and face and so on. But what turned out, that's another parameter, that's heart rate, and here you have facial muscles. You can also try and extract certain emotions or affective states from that. So as you can see, again, that's the same. The text chatbot is much less engaging than the other one. But what was even more interesting for us is what kind of emotion was that? Was it a positive one or a negative one? And then we used some additional questionnaires to kind of understand how people were feeling, how they were assessing or so our chatbot. And it turned out that the one that had face, gaze, and everything was actually very scary to them. And that emotion that we saw as being very intense was actually quite a negative emotion, and they were stressed out that they have to talk to something that is weird, right? And they were not happy doing that. So that was the first part of our research where we were trying to, well, somehow tackle the uncanny valley, and it was somewhat successful. Then we moved further, and that's the second part of our experiment that's also related to trust, and that's something we have used to analyze the logs, the conversations that people had with the chatbot. So what we did, I think it's a bit controversial, we used a tool that you could call very cautiously a micro-targeting tool, but it's not, because it's not influencing people's opinions. It's just trying to build certain categories around their behaviors that they expose or perform online. It's a deep learning tool that allows us to take logs, let's say tweets or Facebook messages, and then try to analyze them and see where do you fit in terms of various categories. The category, for instance, called personality tells us a bit about how you speak to other people. Are you more of a person that, let's say, influences views of others and shares views, or are you a person who's more inquisitive and then questions? And so that would be the category of a journalist. There are, as you can see, some other ideological categories, and this can be done for any person, any brand, any company, really, and I think there are many also companies and research groups that are doing that. What we decided to do is use this tool, called TriFinder, to analyze our chatbot and its conversations. What I did not say before is that our chatbot was not kind of built by us, it was co-built by our students who were feeding it with knowledge, that it was like digesting, let's say. And what we found out, what was very interesting, was that the chatbot indeed has opinions on many different things. It's a tree hugger, so it's environmentally friendly. It's not as spiritual as a person, and it's not a nerd either. It also has certain ideologies. It's a complainer, for instance, so it's resentment-based, surprisingly. But what was even more interesting was that the chatbot was changing its mind. Whenever it was having a longer conversation with a person that fit a different category, the chatbot would try and flip to also fit that category and be in biggest possible alignment with this other person that it was interacting with. And I think this poses lots of questions regarding trust, right? So trust obviously is a very important category. We have the trustor and we have the trustee, and we have the relationship between these two parties, right? Where you are trying to be vulnerable to someone's actions because you trust that this person is going to do you no harm. And I think in terms of technology, it's really a very applicable term. And what is more interesting is that whenever you have a relationship of trust, you have the person who is being trusted, the other person who trusts, and you also have their environment. And whenever you're talking about trust that is put in technology technology matters most in that, right? It matters more than the person who trusts and the external environment. And what we felt was necessary, kind of after doing all that research, to kind of ask and perhaps try to delineate somehow, was what does it trust in chatbot really mean or entail? And we felt that there are at least a few dimensions. One is ability or certain expertise, that the chatbot knows what it talks about, right? Let's assume we have a company that is represented on Messenger by a chatbot. That chatbot should know certain things that it can say to the customer so that the customer is kind of satisfied. You also have a question of privacy and safety, right? There's this very interesting study called Alexa, Can I Trust You? And it's about, whether the chatbot listens all the time or not. How should I feel about it? There is the dimension of anthropomorphism, which is related to the fact how the chatbot looks like and presents itself in terms of gestures, social presence, voice, and so on. And that's, I think, a very important question that we were trying to tackle with the Uncanny Valley study. But there are also some newer dimensions of chatbots that arrive together with deep learning, in fact, and the fact that these chatbots are becoming so sophisticated these days. And this is, first of all, something that was also mentioned by Cornelia, transparency, right? So that you know who is it that you're dealing with, that you know that you're interacting with a machine, that the agent is what it is. There was a very famous case of a telemarketer chatbot that was pretending to be human, and also whenever it was asked, are you human or not, it was like, of course I'm a human, don't say that. I'm offended, right? So that's like really beyond any line. Another thing is predictability or certain integrity, right? So that's something that is important for us because of the second research that we did. If you have a chatbot that is changing its mind constantly, in 1 second it's a Republican and the other it's a Democrat, is that okay, right? Is that how we want it to be? If we have a chatbot that is representing a sports company, should it say, no, I hate sports, just because of the fact that it's interacting with a person that says that or declares that? I think these are very relevant questions for the future. And now, the third one is obviously certain benevolence, that you know that the chatbot kind of wants good things for you, that it's trying to follow you somehow, that it's not going against you. I think it's also related to transparency. So these are obviously, this is just a draft, this is not like a fixed thing, but something to perhaps discuss and talk about. There are some other questions that the previous speakers obviously tackled, and I'm just going to add 2 things to them. Well, in terms of algorithmic bias, we really have a problem because, as Tomáš really said well, algorithmic bias is our bias. Do we have any other pattern that we could follow to build any sort of robust context-aware AI? I'm not sure, right? So we can try and tackle certain features. We can say we have protected features. We're going to try and omit bias in these cases, but this is really a hardcore problem, bias, because it's internally ours and we're building human-like machines. And the other one is like explainability. Very often it's called like a question that is a technical one. I've seen myself at MIT a demonstration of a system that is supposed to dissect a deep neural network that is processing images, and it worked, but only for images. It did not work for numerical data, it did not work for textual data. So we do have an issue of explainability, and it's not only technical, especially when people tell you, well, we cannot have a full explainability, but we can have a system that is going to supervise other systems and roughly tell you why it did what it did. Right? I think it is a bit of a problem, but there are no other better solutions at this point. So we do have to realize how big of an issue that is. And with that, I'm going to thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to proceed further to the stage where we don't use the slides anymore, where we just sit on this stage and really talk to each other.
We'll see about that.
Well, then that would be a background, right? Please come and join me over here. So, well, my first question would be kind of a philosophical one. If we look back into the history of the humankind and how we interacted with the robots or the other resembling human beings. We have also always held a myth of some intelligent creature that would resemble us, right? There have been Galatea, there have been Frankenstein, and so on and so on. There has been Golem, which was told to be existing somewhere here in the streets of Prague. But if we look at the mood around those creatures, if we look at the context, then we see that very few of them are actually the friendly ones, which are there to help the humans. It's like perhaps R2-D2 from Star Wars, you know, but he didn't do well either. So why do you think is it that the consequences of introducing AI or intelligent machines to the society are predominantly negative, and those consequences are brought up in the pop culture and the movies and so on?
I could give it a try. Can you hear me well? No. No? Okay. Well, I think there are a few answers to this question that you just posed, and there's, let's say, a more superficial one and probably a deeper one. And to start with the superficial one, I would probably say that pop culture is really influencing the discourse around new technologies, emerging technologies, artificial intelligence. And pop culture has a specific, I would say, narrative, right? There has to be an enemy, there has to be a struggle. There are certain ways of building, let's say, stories that that can be viewed by people, that people are attracted to. And I think it's much more interesting to show some sort of drama than to show just a paradise of good relationships, right, between humans and machines. So I do think that when you look at it, especially recently, AI has become a very big topic for Hollywood, for for various films and so on. And obviously, it's a certain game where we are trying to put that machine in a particular context. For instance, a class struggle, right? Where we are, certain class is struggling against another class, right? Or an enemy that is the opposite of what you are. Exactly the opposite, right? You have all the bad, he or she has all the bad features, you have all the good ones, and so on. So you can polarize it. And I do think that these images really sell well, and I do think also, maybe that's a controversial statement, that let's say data scientific or artificial intelligence community does not communicate its ideas that well, or it has not. Maybe it was not heard. Maybe AI is just now going mainstream, and because of that we have discussions like this one. But for a very long time, it was a sort of silent endeavor. And I guess, you can absolutely be against what I'm saying right now, but I do think that AI was really a field of very low interest, and I'm basing that on my own example. When I started writing my PhD on chatbots, I've heard at the logics and epistemology department in philosophy that it was a very extravagant topic and nobody really cared. So my supervisor essentially said, "Yeah, Aleksandra, you can do that. Do your little thing out there. It's fine. Go ahead." And that's how it felt. And then 2 or 3 years later, it started really booming, and now it's an explosion, and hopefully a good one, because we can have a discussion, we can collaborate on that, we can exchange ideas. But I think before that, it was really more of an academic scientific endeavor that was hidden somewhere. And then you had this whole imaginary of monsters, and new monsters that were supplied by energy and so on, that you can use so well. So I think it's hard to create a dominant counter-discourse. That's my response.
We can go in the order. Okay, thanks. So I think that one other reason why I have this problem is that maybe because naturally people are afraid of the unknown. So that, for example, if you meet somebody from some very different culture, then you are kind of suspicious to these people, and the AI itself is kind of like some alien form of life, and of course people are going to be afraid, very afraid of that. In addition, of course, to like the popular culture needing some enemy and some drama, which is of course definitely part of it as well. So I think that this is basically creating the atmosphere of that you can see actually these days, that AI is possibly something dangerous. Maybe I can add one more argument that recently I think that many people are actually seeking attention, and if you are talking about a technology that's kind of like boring on its own, then you will not really have a very big audience. While if you talk about a technology that you claim is going to replace us in the future or is going to steal our jobs and so on, which is actually the claims that I read in the media these days about AI, then you suddenly have much bigger audience and more people are going to listen to what you are saying, which I think is quite unfair because some people are doing this unintentionally because they believe in these things, but many others are actually doing this intentionally. They are basically just seeking some way how to enlarge the audience of the people who are listening to them. So I think that it's actually very difficult to talk about AI as it is defined in the popular culture, which is like the computers that you can talk with and so on, which is definitely still a distant future. Also, we have, of course, the chatbots, which is like very interesting technology. I don't think that anybody would seriously claim that we can solve Turing test because that's definitely like very, very far away. And even if you look at, for example, the best chatbots today, and you can find them online. So if you don't have to believe what I'm saying, you can just go online and you can search for chatbots that you can actually try out on your own that are like available on online services. They're actually very dumb, which you will probably find very quickly. One small thing that you can figure out easily is that they basically don't have any memory. That's actually exactly the reason why they are changing their opinions, because they don't remember what they did tell you like in the previous sentence. So this technology is very, very crude and basic. Actually, I was just today talking with Jan Šedivý, who is leading a team of researchers who's participating in this Alexa Prize competition. They ended up second in this competition, like dozens of teams from worldwide. So they have like very, very good chatbot that is totally state-of-the-art, and we didn't have any solution for like this missing memory part as well. Like there are some very, very basic questions that we don't really know how to answer. If you start talking to the chatbot, you tell it what's your name, what food you like, and so on, and then you just ask about what you just said in the next sentence. The chatbot will not know. So it's really like it's a technology that's pretending that it understands what you are saying, but it's just using some cheap tricks. Again, it goes back to Eliza and saying like, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, tell me more, and so on. And when the chatbot doesn't know what to tell you, it will be something like, oh, I can tell you some joke about this and that. So you know, it's really like a very cheap psychological trick. Once you understand the technology behind it, it's very crude, and we don't really have anything intelligent by far. We are like many, many years away from this technology. So I think that there's this like there are several reasons why there is this fear around AI. And again, like it's the popular culture, it's the human nature. We are afraid of the unknown. And then there are, of course, like people who are trying to sell their startups, and they are trying to promote whatever they have, and they will promise you everything. And of course, the dangerous promises look the most interesting. They will say that what you developed works in a way that nobody understands, and it's sort of like crazy technology, and you have to buy it before it goes completely wild. So you know, like you can hear a lot of these stories from startups, and you should take it not so seriously. The best you can do is probably to ask these people for a demo and just tell the chatbot something, ask about it, and the next sentence you will see it just doesn't do anything. So that's maybe my opinion.
Tomáš, and for the research community, do you think that the amount of negative discourse about the AI and this fear could actually bring us to the point of the next AI winter in the future? That everybody would be so afraid that we would actually regulate it that hard or stop research in the field?
Well, I definitely hope that this is not going to happen. Also, some researchers are afraid of it. I hope that if we keep explaining how this technology works, and that actually some of these fears are about some type of technology that we don't have at all, and maybe will not even have for the next 50 years, then maybe the public will finally realize that most of the machine learning is about the type that I was showing in the slides, which is basically just transformation of some input features into some outputs. Which can be very useful. Definitely it can make a lot of money and so on, but it's not some independent life form that will be taking over Earth and destroying humans or anything like that. That's still science fiction, and we should not miss these things.
Thank you.
I'll try to be short. The
we have just a data point which I found quite interesting. The perceptions or the attitudes towards AI is quite different from region to region as well. We were talking about pop culture, but we were really talking about US pop culture. And we have a interesting, wonderful research in Microsoft Joan Crones, who has done a study on facial recognition perceptions in commercial and attitudes of citizens. She used two regions, she used one region in North America, and then she used Germany, which is interesting, I'm German, and then China in researching the attitudes of citizens towards using facial recognition in commercial contexts. And indeed, in the United States, the attitudes were very much driven by this pop culture, which was explained just now. In China, the attitude was mostly driven by something positive, so they did not have the same connotations than in the United States and in Germany, and that is certainly something that I personally can also rely to, is rather positive, but the question, but what if? So what if the regime changes? That is a profound question and attitude that that is something that she found in these specific regions. Now she has only researched surely in China and the United States, but I think it shows a little bit that attitudes very much relate to culture, background, history, and so on and so forth. So it's not only knowing about the AI, I think that there's quite a bit. Then maybe one addition, it's also the context in which we talk. This is obviously a conversation where we have pointed to the challenges that we are talking to, but when you are in a certain sector, for example in manufacturing, then it's largely about efficiencies. You have other challenges in that spaces that relate to work and skills. If you go to the health sector, there you see the real benefits, and it's largely a positive discussion because the AI for good in that space is just so tremendously important that you rarely have the same conversations there, even or especially when it comes to privacy. Same for disability communities. People with disabilities see largely the positive of what AI can bring to them. Sustainability, energy, another one where people that work in that space that try to find solutions for the waste in our oceans, they largely see the positive. So I do think it really it's contextual, and we should not forget about that even when we are talking about the challenges.
Thank you. And then given the fact that different social groups and different, say, nations react differently to the state of the AI, how do you think, or do you think it isn't generally possible to make sure that the technology will be inclusive, given that there is a gap between how different nations and countries have the access to the technologies, and that the risks for some of the nations are just higher compared to the others? Do you think there is a way to keep the AI technological development inclusive?
Maybe I can give first a short answer. I think that actually much of machine learning technology, which is mostly called these days, is actually very inclusive in the sense that the universities and companies that are performing much of this research usually do publish their work as open source, which means that anybody can use it later. So I think that much of this research is very open. We are publishing, as researchers, we are publishing papers that are online, that are for free for everybody to read. We are publishing the code. This is the case of Facebook, this is the case of Google. I think Microsoft does it too. And many other companies. The same again with the research papers. So we are trying to be as inclusive as possible. Much of the technology is actually, again, for free. We have a lot of like web services, again, like Google, Facebook, and so on. You can talk, for example, about translation and so on. Many of these technologies are actually essentially for free, and in that case, they are very inclusive.
A couple of dimensions. I think there's certainly a challenge in adoption of AI in companies. Bigger companies versus smaller companies. There's challenges in which countries can adopt AI strategies quicker. So that inclusiveness or has different dimensions. In our principles, you will have seen that we also talk about inclusiveness. There's a different type of inclusiveness that we should also talk about, which is if you want to have unbiased or AI or diminish the bias that is in the development, you need to have diverse workforce as well. That's part of inclusiveness discussion as well. You need to have gender inclusiveness, race inclusiveness in order to get to a fair AI environment. So there's a number of challenges that are part of that. Of course, yes, open source, that is something that is part of that, the democratizing AI as we call it. It's available to many. We also have programs that allow NGOs to use AI, but there are in that space of inclusiveness certainly challenges. In particular, when we have some LinkedIn data around AI talent in Europe, and when you look at the gender balance between men and women, there's huge challenges in that space.
Okay, so perhaps I would say that the fact that we have multiple attitudes towards AI could be enriching, right? So I would say yes, there is an issue of accessibility of tools that is already now greatly solved, right? So in many areas we have available tools and so on. There's a question of data, right? So how can you scale up? You can have a free available tool to do your machine learning. The question is, how can you feed your system with quality data? Can you have that, right? In order to really advance in the field. Because I think accessing the field on the very simple level is definitely in many ways already solved. But I'm not sure if I would link it with, different attitudes. You just said that, in terms of Turing test, that when people realize that it's just a crude technology, they shouldn't worry about it. Well, first of all, the Turing test was solved. Not solved, but it was passed by at least a few technologies because people participate in it, right? So people interact with technologies, putting their beliefs and intentions in that interaction. So whenever, even when you say that, okay, this is just a crude technology, actually during the flow of interaction, that changes. Because if the flow is there, you will suspend the beliefs very often that it's just a technology. And that's why something like a bot that simulates being a 14-year-old Ukrainian boy can receive a Leibniz Prize and pass the Turing test, and it did already in 2014, and there were several other technologies that did. And I think it's going to impact that deep learning is going to impact that even more severely, that we will have technologies that will be able, at least in certain fields and narrow specialization, to really interact with people on that higher level. But what I wanted to also say is that these attitudes change, and that's also very, very relevant, because even if you say this is just a crude technology, for instance in Japan, that doesn't have to be the proper perspective. In Japan, many people claim the acceptance towards social robots. Actually, many of them are already used in elderly care, in healthcare, and in many different fields. It stems also probably from the fact that there's Shintoism there as a belief that allows you to think that whenever you are dealing with some sort of object around you, it may have a soul, right? right? And that's a very simple, very much a simplified vision of what it really is. But many researchers, also from Japan, claim that this is also influencing the way technologies are treated there. So I wouldn't really, neglect that phase and or that sphere, right, of people's emotions. And I would say perhaps there's a richness to the fact that we have different pathways of adopting AI, that we can specialize also in many different domains of it and treat it differently. So perhaps to look from a different perspective, we could treat it as a nice way of decentralizing AI, right? Making it a project that consists of many different things. So at MIT, I work in a department called Collective Intelligence. It's all about swarm intelligence and dynamics, and how different agents can contribute to a better quality within a team, right? How many agents actually raise or generate bigger quality than just individuals. And perhaps AI could be a decentralized project, obviously when we agree on certain ethical baseline, but it could be a decentralized project with many different agents and many different perspectives. There will not be just one AI, one Terminator that will kill you, or one techno-god that will save you, right? Rather, a society of different agents, hybrid society, so to speak, that interacts with each other in different ways.
Thank you. Yeah, Tomáš, I was just about to suggest.
Well, I would just react to that claim that Turing has been solved, which actually is not true. And when it comes to Lebanon price, then again, serious AI researchers would not really say that the Lebanon price is very relevant. It's actually more or less like a joke price for most of the researchers. I can just explain why. I don't know if everybody actually knows what the Turing test is, so I can just quickly say what's the spirit. Imagine that you are communicating with someone over, say, Messenger or some communication platform, and you have to decide whether the other side is a human or whether it's a computer. And that was Alan Turing, more or less, idea from the 50s. He basically claimed that you don't have to try to define many of these philosophical concepts like the soul and intelligence and so on, and you can just try to think what would be the behavior of an intelligent machine. And he basically predicted that maybe in 50 years, which actually didn't happen, we'll be able to basically build a machine that can communicate with you in a way that will be not really distinguishable from another human. That actually didn't happen, and for that there's this Lebanon Prize efforts. When there was this news in the media like a couple of years ago that some program that passed the Turing test, the principal was actually more like abusing the Turing test. It was not actually solving it. So to be more concrete, you can say that you will define the rules that if 50% of the committee is convinced that they are talking with a human while it's actually a computer, then you did just pass the test. I think it was I don't really remember the number, sorry, it was 40% or something, 30 maybe. But now imagine a case where you will be talking with somebody who repeats one sentence only, and there will be, I don't understand English. So you just communicate with this person or a computer. And you are supposed to decide whether it's a person or a computer. Well, what's the probability that you will make a correct decision? Well, about 50%, right? If you run this test with the right committee and a significant number of times, you can maybe get into 60 or 70. Actually, is this program that prints, I don't understand English, is it artificially intelligent? Well, not really. So for these reasons, actually, some people claim that the Turing test should be more precisely defined. I think if we stay with the spirit of the Turing test, then the Lebanon Prize, of course, is invalid test, and it's really like about a computer that is supposed to be as good in the communication as a good human, and not as bad as the worst possible human you can pick. So in this sense, of course, you would imagine that the computer should really be able to talk with you in some reasonable way. It should have the memory, which is the thing that currently machine learning struggles with, and that's something that is more like something for the future for us, researchers to develop this kind of technology. So just quick explanation of what this Turing test is, because often there are these strange claims about it, whether it was passed or not. I see it in the media once in a while, and it's very manipulative for this reason.
Well, it's good that one thing that we all agree on is that the interpretability of AI and the black box problem is something which is standing in our way to trusting the machines. In other words, for as long as we cannot explain and understand fully how the machine works, how the artificial intelligence agent works, we cannot put our full trust in it, given that the trust in the technology is a whole multidimensional thing by itself. Thus, there is a very recent and massive movement and efforts towards the explainable AI. What is your opinion on that? Do you think that we need to understand something or the processes that are behind something fully in order to be able to regulate that or develop that further? Or do you think that from the technological perspective, there might be a risk of actually having to, artificially dump down the speed of the development in order to keep it explainable? And is there any, good answer to that question?
So first of all, there's an enormous amount of research going on in order to make algorithms more intelligible rather than transparent, I'd say. At the same time, we have numerous legal obligations that are currently formed and starting to become law on the transparency. And it's interesting just to look at what's happening on both sides. On the legal side, there's currently two legislations that require algorithm transparency. The one is really a competition rule that allows or shall give transparency to companies that, for example, use marketplaces to sell. Meaning, you have Amazon and there's sellers using the platform. They get degraded. They want to understand why. They want to understand whether their commercial relation with Amazon is fair. So that is now something that is starting to become law. That's a ranking explanation that will be required. Similar, there will be a law for consumers as well on understanding better the ranking of search results, for example. Sometimes you do wonder. The other one is more related to decision making. Partially that is in the data protection regulation. You have a right to a reasonable explanation if that decision affects you and there's no human in between. This is the human in the loop. And now there is this bigger question: who is actually asking for the intelligibility in order to do what? I think when we start to go down into what we are actually aiming at with the transparency or intelligibility, we are getting much better in trying to find solutions to do it. Meaning, for example, there's research done by wonderful young academics at the Oxford Internet Institute and Turing Institute that have developed a theory on counterfactual explanation, which we find quite attractive, which really looks at what does a consumer need to know when a decision is made. And an example would be a loan given to him. Now, if you don't get your loan to buy your apartment or buy a new car, you don't really want to understand how the algorithm works, nor do you want to see a source code of any software that affects you. What you really want to know, what is the parameters that would have come to a different example. That's why counterfactual. So if the explanation then would only be, oh, if you had 500 or 100 euros, or here it's crowns, more per month to pay back, we could have given you a loan, or if the interest rate would be lower or higher, etc., etc. So this is one way of thinking through. Is the other way of thinking about transparency. And again, here we have, and I'm citing a lot of Microsoft researchers, for which I apologize. And that's those I have close contact with. Hannah Wallach, a wonderful young researcher as well, who works a lot on accountability. She has, with other researchers together, called for action and called for, her phrase is data sheets for data sets. It's not so much about the algorithm transparency, but to understand what data sets were used when the algorithm is developed, and who and for what reason were the data collected. Because you have obviously a life cycle of AI. You have a development for specific use, and then it's going to be used and applied by others. So such data sets or documentation by design, some call it now in a more regulatory context, will help them to get to transparency. And it's not so short as I thought, I'm sorry for that. But we also, from a regulatory perspective, of course, want to understand transparency is a tool, and transparency is a tool for accountability. If you have transparency, you can actually then hold someone accountable for something. And so any of these type of solutions that are currently developed will probably help us in getting there. Thank you, Cornelia.
Well, maybe I can add to it something as well, although I think it's a very difficult topic. Explainable AI is definitely interesting for many people these days. One of the problems is that when we actually, from the technological point of view, when we use our machine learning models, they often represent the kind of like a solution or like the computation that comes at the right output, right from our point of view, in a way that is actually quite different from the way people think. And in that case, it's actually quite difficult to explain and interpret the logic of the machine. If you, for example, just tell the user that the feature number 5 was too high, so the decision is yes instead of no, then that's actually like not a very good explanation. And again, like many of the solutions found to problems by machine learning actually quite widely different to our type of thinking. So it's actually like quite an active area of research at the moment to actually come up with some explainable machine learning, and I hope that in the future we will see some interesting progress, but it's like very much open research problem at the moment.
Well, I would just perhaps add, leaving aside the question of chatbots and the power of simulation, both in human interaction and human-chat interaction, that when it comes to explainability, what we kind of perhaps have seen over the 2 years that, that we've tried to address these problems somehow. It is true that they were somehow delineated before, but I think only now, after 2016 and many different problems related to data science, AI, and so on, people just, I think, agreed, at least in some parts of the world, that this is a major issue to tackle. And what we do see now, after some attempts, a year or two, let's say, perhaps a bit longer, is that for some types of data this is easier. And for instance, this NetDissect tool that I've mentioned during my presentation is a demonstration of that. That, for instance, for image data, this can be easier done than in some other types of data. So I do think that these efforts should not stop, and that both research and development centers and companies and and the scientific community could and should contribute to it together. But I also think that perhaps in some cases certain level of explainability could be sufficient, and we could still try to move forward. So I did have an opinion that we should stop, and I think major scale deployments in spaces where data is super sensitive, and for instance when we're dealing with medical diagnosis here, I would perhaps wait for some bigger degree of explainability before rolling out major projects. But on the other hand, I do know that AI is really needed in many different fields. So just putting a ban on it perhaps is not a solution either, especially that not everyone would put a ban on it. So that's another, let's say, geopolitical issue to consider in that. But I do think that that in terms of explainability, a lot is happening these days, and I do not exclude that we will see major breakthroughs in 2019, 2020 perhaps. That will be a great thing.
Thank you. Well then, last brief question about the AI regulation field. Just to your personal thinking and to your personal experience, what do you think in the future the ideal outcome of the AI regulation could look like? Do you think there is a chance that it could be something like, very universal, like the Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, or would it rather be something more complex with multiple conditions, exceptions, like the social credit system in China that you mentioned? Do you think we have a chance to keep it simple, or would it necessarily be complex and conditional?
Yeah, I don't. So if intuition is something which the AI can't yet do, but intuition is largely based on experience, and so my intuition, based on my experience, is it's not going to be simple. If you just look at GDPR, it's a very complex regulation. What I can, there is, as I pointed out, there is already hints what we're going to see and which are the areas where regulators focus in on. One is liability. I think that is a major one that needs to be solved to understand how that it's just liability is just something so fundamental for working in the market. People need to know who can be held liable if there is damage to humans, to life, or simply financial damages that it's just in a market system needs to be solved. There's interesting discussions in how that is going to be solved. Largely, I think there is a tendency to think through the insurance part of liability. If you have an insurance obligation, you can actually solve the economic part of it. So that's going to be something that's coming very separate from other areas. Then, from the last 5 years of EU regulation, I'd say there has been missed opportunities in simplifying some of that. In fact, we are coming from a very sectoral market, so we have very much sectoral regulation. We saw some horizontal regulation. I think it's going to go back in sectoral legislation. We're going to see this already. We're having now AI discussions in health, in manufacturing, in automotive, and often in order to not disturb what's going to happen is we are going to see additions, amendments, reforms of existing law, and that's often, I think that's to a certain extent the biggest threat here is when you start from a law that is already existing, you're actually not, you do not start from scratch. My dream would be that we actually start from scratch and build a new law for AI. I think we could eventually reach a simplified version. But
So revolution versus evolution.
yeah.
From my point of view, I find this discussion a bit strange because we don't have laws, for example, for regulating use of statistical models for example, forecasting better. Why should we have laws for regulating AI? Where actually AI is much closer to statistics at the moment than anything else. It's really like quite strange for researchers, I must say, because I'm talking to them all the time. Whenever these regulations are discussed, it also makes a sense for a couple of reasons that if you rely on these systems too much in some sensitive applications, then they really can influence the life of people in a big way. So it's very hard to actually say what should we think of this. Definitely researchers don't want to be limited in any way, of course, when it comes to creating new models, but when it comes to their deployment in different areas, then it's a different question. Maybe some of these applications should be verified or double-checked so that we are sure that the outputs are used correctly, but it's a big question how this should be done actually in the future. I think, for example, this application to medical cases is a very interesting one because we can think at it from multiple point of views. For example, we don't have to think of using machine learning at all for medical diagnosis, for example. But then we are losing as a society quite a lot, because like AI can represent like the knowledge of like some thousands of doctors, average knowledge of these thousands of doctors when it comes to diagnosis of many diseases, in which case it will be much more precise than any single doctor. And we don't use this AI, then we are basically causing a lot of costs for the society, people being ill, using like incorrect treatment and so on. And if we actually limit the use of machine learning / AI too much, then we are basically going to pay this price, which just doesn't seem to be a good decision at all. I think we should be rather thinking about how to apply machine learning to these areas as quickly as possible, and there are actually many regulations when it comes to healthcare and the use of machine learning, which I think already are like not good at all for the society, because they're like we can't use models that we know would be much more accurate than doctors because of the existing regulations and difficulties with like the access to the data sets. So I think it's like a big question, and many companies these days are looking to how to address this correctly. Maybe best solution would be if the states like European Union and US would actually be part of the discussion, and if, for example, this Medicare AI would not be maintained by a commercial company that is seeking to maximize profit, but if it would be actually operated by say, for example, a health insurance company or somebody like that, which is trying to minimize the cost and keep people as healthy as possible. I'm just thinking about it. I'm not saying that it has to be done this way, but oh, sorry, does it work? This one doesn't work as well. Okay. So, just to talk like this. So I think it would be great if you would actually figure out how to start using AI in many areas that are currently already restricted, and coming up with even more restrictions is probably just going to delay the use of this technology, which I think is kind of unlucky. It would be definitely good if there has to be some set of rules, if it would be very simple. Let's see what the future will bring us, but I'm definitely not hopeful for anything like these laws of robotics, which I think are just so high level that I don't think that any sufficiently complex AI can follow them. So we shall see what the future will bring us, and I hope that the application of AI in many areas will be not delayed too much by fears that are often like based on kind of like incorrect impression of the abilities of the AI and its supposed independence, which simply is not the case. AI is not independent. AI is these days applied machine learning, and it's like just doing the functionality that we human programmers implement, so that it will be doing it. It's not independent life form. It's like just simple statistical models that we have. They can be very powerful. I think especially in healthcare we should be using them. So let's hope that everything will go fine in the future.
Okay, so I would just say that perhaps what matters more is more than regulations is a certain work ethics, because you mentioned human programmers, so people who are actually essentially now responsible for these systems. There is this AI Institute, AI Now, I think it's called, in New York, and they've been checking curricula of how computer science, data science students are being taught. And it turns out that ethics is that particular topic that is usually landing on Friday in the evening when everybody has beers or something. And it's kind of at least partially neglected. And this is like the data they've been presenting. So I think it really matters more to focus on that. And in the US, where I also partially work, I hear more about artificial intelligence ethics and governance than about regulations, because I do think that in some spheres regulations are necessary. I do know that Elon Musk currently wants to rewrite the Asimov's laws, and he came up with something called Asilomar principles, apparently. These are 10 and not 3, and you can find them online. I guess this is still a very high level, very much a high level thing, but it's, I guess, aligned with his goals of making, let's say, AI more explainable, and thus these rules are obviously not regulations per se, but perhaps some code of conduct for the community. So in that sense, I would perhaps think that, you know, first ethics and then maybe regulations.
Well, thank you. And with this, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their time today. This has been very interesting, and all of you are very welcome to take this discussion down to the mingling, networking, and sharing your opinions about it. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks again on behalf of Aspen, Opero, and Neuron, and see you here next time. Thank you.